The smell she would carry to the end of her life was starch and lye and hot iron. And on that raw October night in Salt Fork, it was the smell of everything her family had left in the world. Suki worked the last shirts by the light of a single coal oil lamp, her sleeves pushed past the elbow, the flat iron hissing when she touched its face to the damp cotton. The big coppers had gone quiet on the stove, their water cooling to gray. Above the counter, on the little shelf beside the wooden tray of paper laundry tickets, sat the two things that mattered more than the whole rickety wash house around them: her mother's spirit tablet, carved and lacquered and carried across an ocean, and a letter folded into a small hard square, come 3 weeks past from the village in Sunwee, and read so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. At the mangle, her father coughed the dry cough that had lived in his chest all winter, and hummed under it, low, an old tune from a country neither of them would likely see again. She heard the boots before she understood them. Not the ordinary scatter of miners drifting home from the Comstock saloons, but many boots, falling together, and under the boots a sound like a crowd holding one breath. Suki set the iron on its trivet and went still, the way her father had taught her to go still the first week they came up from the coast. Eyes down, lamp low, door barred against the dark. Through the front glass she saw the orange bloom of pitch pine torches coming up the street, and at the head of them the wide, pale face of Cal Pruitt, who ran the freight yard and the Anti-Coolie League both, and who had come into this shop once to say the corner would make a fine office if the Chinaman ever cleared off it. A rock went through the window. Then a bottle of coal oil, trailing fire, and the front of the wash house went up with a sound like a great indrawn breath, and the heat slapped her back into the shelves. She had her mother's jade at her throat and her father's arm in her two hands, and she was pulling him toward the back door through smoke that turned the lamp to a smear, and they were almost out, almost into the clean, cold air of the alley, when she felt him twist against her. The tablet. He had seen the flame reaching up the shelf toward his dead wife's name, and something older than sense turned the frail old man in her grip and sent him staggering back into the burning shop. She screamed his name into the roar and could not follow. The fire stood between them like a wall, and then a shape came past her out of the dark of the alley, a man on foot, hatless, and shouldered through the flame where she could not go. He came out with her father folded against his chest and the lacquered tablet clamped in the old man's arms, and he laid them both down in the mud of the alley as the roof gave way behind them, and the whole of the Choi family's life fell into itself in a fountain of sparks. The man knelt with his hands held out from his body, and in the light of the fire she saw the skin of his forearms gone shining and wrong, and she saw his face, and knew it. The quiet one, the ranch hand who brought his shirts every Saturday at closing time, and paid in silence and left. He was breathing hard through his teeth and looking at her father the way a man looks at a thing he has decided not to lose. Sukye knelt in the ash with her mother's name saved and her home destroyed, and could not for the life of her understand why a white man in Salt Fork had walked into a Chinaman's fire. By first light there was nothing left but a black square of ruins steaming in the cold, and a town that walked past it on its way to breakfast without slowing down. Some of the men who passed had been carrying torches the night before. She knew their faces, and they knew she knew, and it made no difference at all. A countryman named Leung, who kept the grocery 2 doors down, had taken her and her father in behind his store, laid them a pallet among the barrels of salt fish and dried lily, and the smell of his ancestor incense, and old Choi lay there gray and silent, staring at the boards of the ceiling, his life's work turned to charcoal, and his hands too shamed to move. Suki sat by him and did not weep, because weeping was a thing you did when there was nothing left to do, and she had not yet decided that there was nothing left. There was a thing the town did not know about the gray old man who lay staring at Leung's ceiling, and it was a thing that made the ruin of the wash house heavier than any of them could have guessed. In the village of Sunwee, her father had been a man of letters. He had brushed poetry on red paper for weddings and copied out the classics for other men's sons and sat for the district examinations 3 times. And if the world had been ordered by merit rather than by silver, he might have worn a scholar's cap to his grave. Instead, the rice had failed and the taxes had not, and he had crossed the ocean like 10,000 others to boil other men's shirts on the Gold Mountain and send the coins home, and the town of Salt Fork had looked at his queue and his careful downcast eyes and called him John, the way it called every Chinese man John, and had never once troubled to learn that his name was Choi Man-hei, or that the cracked yellow hands wringing its collars had once held a brush that men rode from 3 villages to borrow. Suki knew, she had always known, And it was for that man, and not only for the boards and the copper, that she wiped her face and squared her small shoulders and went out to see what the morning held. She came out into the gray morning, meaning only to look at the wreck of it, to measure the size of the thing that had happened to them, and there was a wagon standing in the road, and a man unloading planks of new pine off the back of it one at a time. It was him. In the daylight, she saw him whole for the first time, lean and weathered, perhaps 30, a face that gave away nothing, sandy hair gone dark with sweat though the morning was cold, and the burns of last night wrapped now in strips of clean rag that she recognized, with a small strange jolt, as pieces of a shirt she herself had washed for him a dozen times. He was pulling the fallen timbers off the foundation stones and stacking them, sorting the black from the sound, and he did it without hurry and without looking at her, as though clearing a Chinaman's burned lot were the most natural morning's work in the world. "Mister," she said, and her voice came out harder than she meant. In Salt Fork, a white man's kindness always had a bill at the bottom of it, and she had learned to read the bill before she took the gift. "We cannot pay you." He straightened with a scorched board in his ruined hands and looked at her, and it was a long look, level and quiet. The look of a man who did not spend words he did not have. "Didn't ask you to," he said. He set the board on the sound pile. "Name's Landry. Joss Landry. Corner wants clearing before you can build. I'll come back come morning." And he touched 2 fingers to the brim of the hat that wasn't there, and caught himself, and turned back to the timbers. And Sukye stood with the ash cold under her thin shoes, and did not know whether to thank him or to be afraid of a man who would give so much and ask for nothing, because in her experience, the second kind was more dangerous than the first. He came back the next morning, and the one after that, and the one after that. Before the sun cleared the ridge, he was there sorting lumber, and after his days hauling for the freight yard, he was there again in the blue dusk with a hammer, and board by board, a frame began to stand up out of the black square where the wash house had been. The town made a spectacle of it. Men leaned in the door of the Nugget across the street and laughed and called things she was glad her father's English could not follow. A boy threw a clod of dry mud that struck Joss between the shoulders and burst. Joss did not turn around, only reached for the next board, and after a while, the boy grew bored of a target that would not flinch and went away. Cal Prewitt walked past twice, slow, and looked at the rising frame with the patience of a man who has burned a thing once and knows he can burn it again. Her father would not go near it. "A gift like that is a hook with meat on it," he said in Cantonese, from his palate among the salt fish, his old eyes hard with the wisdom that had kept them alive. "One day he names his price, and you will find you have already swallowed it." So Sukyi did the only thing her pride would allow. She refused to be given to. She took his torn work shirts and his single good coat and washed and mended them in Lung's back room and returned them folded and would not hear of coin. She heated water on Lung's little stove and carried a cup of tea out to him in the cold, chrysanthemum for the lungs, the way her mother had made it, and stood while he drank it, watching him turn the strange pale flowers over with his tongue and decide, gravely, that he liked it. It was over that tea that something first passed between them that had no business passing. He had paused with the cup in his scarred hands, and his eyes had gone to her throat where the jade showed above her collar, a smooth ring of pale green stone worn soft with handling. He did not reach for it. He only looked, and then looked up and found her watching him look, and neither of them turned away when they should have. The steam rose between them in the cold air, a beat too long, and then another, and then Sukye took the empty cup from his hand with her eyes down and her face gone hot, and went back inside, and told herself it was only the steam off the tea, and did not believe herself even as she thought it. The frame became walls, and the walls took a roof, and through the short cold days of building, she learned the shape of his silence, and he learned the iron in her. She would not be spared. When he lifted, she lifted. When he sawed, she held the far end of the board with her small, strong hands, and did not let it drift, and after the first day of trying to wave her off, he stopped trying, and something in the set of his shoulders said he had come to like working beside a woman who would not step back. They spoke little, and what they spoke was small. A board, a nail, the weather turning, but one gray afternoon, close over the same length of pine, she found herself looking at the old burns on his forearms, the shining puckered skin that ran up past where any new burn from her fire could reach, scars gone white and years old. "These are not from my fire," she said. He went still, the way a deer goes still. For a moment she thought he would not answer at all, and she was already ashamed of having asked, when he said, very low, "No." His jaw worked under the day's stubble. "Long time back. Boy, aye." He stopped. He picked up the hammer, weighed it in his hand as though it had grown heavy. "Doesn't signify," he said, and drove a nail with 3 hard strokes that did not need to be so hard, and would not look at her again that day. But a little later a spark jumped from the burn barrel where they were feeding the scrap. One small orange spark riding up on the heat, and she saw the whole of him flinch from it, a full-body recoil quick as a struck hand, before he mastered it and stood breathing. Her father had watched all of it from the doorway of Lung's store, sitting in the sun with a quilt over his knees, and his suspicion wrapped around him tighter than the quilt, and for a long while he had said nothing at all. But there came an afternoon when Joss could not make the new copper sit true on its brickwork, and cursed it soft and patient under his breath, and turned it and could not get the fire to draw even beneath, and old Choi could bear it no longer. He rose with his joints cracking and crossed the road one slow step at a time, and crouched by the copper, and, without a word of a language the man could follow, took Joss's ruined hand in his stained one, and moved it to show him, here, the brick a finger higher, here. The draft turned to the east, where the morning wind would help it, and the two of them knelt together over the firebox a long while, the fugitive scholar and the silent cowboy, until the flame ran clean and blue under the water, and the old man grunted once, which from him was a whole oration. That evening her father drank his tea and said, to no one, to the ceiling, "He listens." A man who listens is not all bad, and Suki, folding shirts in the corner, kept her face very still and her heart anything but. She lay awake that night on the pallet beside her father, listening to his cough and to Lung's clock ticking in the dark among the saltfish, and turned the thing over and over. The man rebuilding her family's fire-ruined life was himself a man the fire had ruined. He came back every single morning to the smell of char and cold ash, the very smell that made him flinch, and stood in it for hours with his ruined hands, and she could not fathom what such a thing cost him, or what wound could be so deep that a man would choose to press his thumb against it every day of his life. She fell asleep still wondering, and woke before dawn already listening for the sound of his wagon in the road, and was angry with herself for listening, and listened anyway. By the time the first hard frost silvered the boardwalks, the wash house stood again, smaller than before, plainer, but sound, with a new copper her father wept to see, and a stovepipe drawing clean and straight. And that was when Cal Pruitt came to collect. He came on a Tuesday with 2 of his freight men at his back and a folded paper in his fist, and he stood in the middle of the new swept floor, as though he already owned it, and read out an offer to buy the lot, a price so low it was an insult wearing the coat of a bargain, and made it plain, in words that did not need to be plain, that a Chinaman who would not sell to Cal Pruitt might find his troubles were not finished.
"This here's a white man's town, John," he said to her father, using the name the town used for every Chinese man alive, as if they had no other. "You'd do well to take the money while there's money offered." Joss was there, mending the door hinge, and he stood up slow and set himself between Pruitt and the old man without a word. And the whole room understood the thing that Joss's face would not say, that he was Pruitt's own hired man, that he hauled Pruitt's freight for Pruitt's wages, and that he had just chosen, in front of witnesses, a side. Pruitt looked at him a long moment, with his pale eyes gone flat, and then he laughed, short and ugly, and said, "So that's the way of it," and folded his paper and went, and everyone in the room knew that something had been decided that could not now be undone. The days after that scene were the loneliest she had known since the boat. The League papered the town with handbills that called her people a plague and a filth, and a theft of honest wages, and she read the English of them slowly, standing in the cold, so that no one could say she did not know what was thought of her. The great Chinese companies that might have spoken for them were 400 miles away in the city, and had troubles enough of their own, and the sheriff of Salt Fork drew his pay from the men who paid Cal Pruitt, and there was no door in that town she could knock upon and be sure of an answer. And yet she opened the wash house every dawn, and swept the boardwalk clean, and hung the wet sheets in the biting wind with her chin level and her eyes ahead, because a woman who bows her head to hide is only teaching the world where to strike, and her mother had not raised her to be struck. When the assayer's wife brought her linens as always, and lingered, and said quietly that it was a shame, a pure shame, what men would do. Suk-yi only bowed and thanked her, and took the bundle, and did not let the woman see how much that one plain kindness had cost her to keep from weeping over. That evening, when Joss had gone back toward the ranch in the failing light and her father slept, Suk-yi took the small, hard square of letter from the shelf and unfolded it and read it again, though she knew every character by heart. It was from the marriage broker in San Francisco, on behalf of a merchant named Fong, who kept a store on DuPont Street and wanted a wife from a good village family. And it said the bride price was already sent to her father's brother in Sunhui, and it asked when the girl would come down to the city to be married. Her father had wept over it with relief. Here was safety for his daughter when his own cough finally took him, a roof and a name and a Chinese husband, the right and ordered thing. She stood in the doorway of the rebuilt wash house with the letter in one hand and her mother's jade cold under the other, and watched the last of Joss Landry disappear into the dusk, and felt the two futures pulling at her like two currents in a river, and did not know which one she was brave enough to want.
They hung the first red lantern on a still, cold night at the end of the month, her father's idea, a small paper lantern over the new door, for luck, for the ancestors, to say to the street that the Choi family was not gone. Joss had stayed to see it lit, and when the little flame caught inside the red paper and threw its warm color out across the boards, Suk-yi saw him watching the flame the way he always watched flame, braced against it, and she said, quietly, so her father would not hear, "You may tell me now, about the boy." And this time he told her. He told her about a brother named Danny, younger by 6 years, the only family left to him after the war took the rest, and a boarding house in a Kansas cattle town where they had bunked one winter, and a fire in the black hours of the morning, and a door that would not open. Latched from outside, he said, staring into the lantern, his voice flat and terrible in its evenness. Some fool's notion of keeping the drink-crazed from wandering. I got out the window. I couldn't. The door was hot as a stove, and I beat on it till the skin came off my hands, and it never opened. He looked down at his ruined forearms. I've not been able to abide the sight of fire since. Crossed the street to keep off a bonfire, and then your place went up with your daddy inside it, and I found I could either stand in the road being a coward the rest of my life, or I could go in.
He was quiet a moment. First time since Danny the Fire didn't win. She did not know she was going to speak of her mother until she was speaking. She told him of the crowded dock at Hong Kong and her mother pressing the jade ring into her palm and folding her fingers over it. Ping on, safe passage, so that wherever the ocean carried her, some small green piece of home would carry her back. She told him her mother had died of the coughing sickness the second winter in California, and that the jade was the only warm thing left of her hands. And she looked up and found that in the telling they had come close. So close she could see the lantern flame doubled in his eyes, and his scarred hand had risen and was hovering at the loose strand of hair by her cheek, not quite touching. And she wanted, with a wanting that frightened her more than the mob had, to lean the last inch into that ruined hand. Instead, she stepped back, because the letter was in her sleeve, and her father's relief was in her ears, and duty was a wall an ocean high. She said, "I cannot," and saw the hand fall, and went inside, and pressed the cold jade to her lips in the dark, and could not tell whether she was honoring her mother or betraying her own heart. The trouble came faster after that, the way trouble does once it has scented weakness. Prewitt had not been idle. Suk-yi heard it first as a whisper along the boardwalk, the way she heard everything, with her eyes down and her ears open while she took in bundles of wash, that the League had set a night, that come the dark of the month, the working men of Salt Fork meant to do to the whole Chinese block what had been done to the Choi laundry alone, to clear the Celestials out of the diggings for good, as men had already cleared them from Truckee and the coast towns down the line.
She weighed the shirts on the brass steelyard with a steady hand and a heart gone to ice, and said nothing to her father's happy, ignorant face, and made her plans in the cold country behind her eyes. Joss came to her 2 nights before the day, and he came badly. He came in the dark with one eye swollen shut and his lip split and dried blood black in the corner of his mouth, and she knew before he spoke that the price of choosing her side had come due. Pruitt had turned him off the freight yard, and Pruitt's men had caught him behind the livery to teach the lesson properly, and he had let them, mostly, because a man who fought back would have been shot for it, and no law in Salt Fork would have called it murder. "They mean to burn you out Thursday night," he said, gripping the edge of the counter, and his blood dripped once, twice, onto the clean new floorboards he had planed with his own hands. "All of you. The whole block. You've got to take your daddy and go. Tonight. Down to the city where there's numbers enough to be safe." But she looked at the blood of a man who had been beaten for standing beside her, and at her father's spirit tablet on the shelf, and at the walls this ruined stranger had raised board by board out of the ash of her life, and something in her that had bowed its head for years lifted it. "No," she said. "I have run once. I ran out of that door into the alley, and I watched everything burn, and I will not do it again."
And Joss looked at her for a long moment, out of his one good eye, and she saw him understand that she meant it, and saw him decide, quietly, the way he decided everything, that if she would not run, then neither would he. And so the two of them and one frail coughing old man stood in a lamplit wash-house 2 nights before. The whole town meant to come with fire, and there was no law between them and the dark. And Suki looked at the blood drying on the floor, and wondered whether she had just chosen love or chosen death, and whether, in Salt Fork, there had ever been a difference. They came Thursday night as promised, up the middle of the street with torches streaming, 30 men and more, and Cal Pruitt at the head of them with a pistol on his hip and a brand of pitch pine burning in his fist. But this time, the door of the wash-house was not barred and dark. This time it stood open, and the red lantern burned over it, and Joss Landry stood on the boardwalk in front of it, with his empty, scarred hands hanging loose at his sides, and Suk Yi and her father in the lit doorway behind him. The mob slowed. A white man standing in the light was not the thing they had come to burn, and it made them uncertain, and their uncertainty was a crack, and into that crack Joss spoke. "Cal," he said, not loud, but the street had gone quiet enough to carry it. "You want this corner, you'll take it through me.
I've been in one fire already for these people, I'll stand in another." He let that sit, then he looked past Pruitt at the faces behind him, men he had hauled freight with, drunk with, wintered with. "Some of you bring your wash here Saturdays. This old man mended coats for half of you on credit the year the mine shut and never once dunned you for it. You want to tell your children you came in the night with fire and burned out the folks that patched your britches? Go on home." A man near the back lowered his torch and looked at it. Then another. The assayer's wife, whose good linen Sukie had washed for 2 years, came out onto her own porch in her nightdress and said, "Clear across the street. Cal Pruitt, you go home, you drunken fool." And the crack widened. Pruitt saw his mob coming apart in his hands, and his face twisted, and he did the thing that men like him do when the crowd will not carry them. He made it personal. He drew back his arm and threw the burning brand straight at the open door, at the old man, at the lantern, at everything Joss had built. And Sukie saw Joss Landry, who crossed the street to keep off a bonfire, who had flinched from a single spark for 10 years, step sideways into the path of the fire and catch it against his own chest and close his ruined hands around the flame. He went down to one knee with it, smothering it against the boards of the porch, the fire he had run from all his life pressed into his scarred palms. And it burned him, and it did not unmake him, because she was behind him in the light. And when it guttered out, there was only smoke and the smell of char and a terrible ringing silence in the street. And Sukie stood with her hand pressed to her mouth and her heart stopped in her chest, not knowing if the next sound would be Pruitt's pistol or the mercy of a town coming to its senses. It was neither, at first. It was one man's boots on the boardwalk, and then a dozen, as the mob simply turned and went, ashamed, into the dark. No drama to it, only the small, ordinary sound of cowardice finding the door. Pruitt stood alone in the middle of the street with an empty hand and 30 men's worth of nerve draining out of him, and when the sheriff finally appeared, roused too late and glad of an easy answer, it was Pruitt he took by the arm, because a burned-out mob wants a man to blame, and Pruitt was the only one left standing in the road. He went cursing, and he did not come back, and the corner that he had wanted was never his. And Sukye was already on her knees beside Joss, cradling his blistered hands palm up in her lap the way she had once cradled tea for him. And he was looking up at her, and there was no room left in either of them for anything but the truth. "I'm not leaving," he said, through the pain. "And it was not about the town. You hear me? Whatever your letter says, whatever they say, I'm not ever leaving." And Sukye, who had crossed an ocean, who had watched her home burn twice, and had learned to keep her wanting, locked behind an ocean-high wall of duty, felt the wall come down, all at once, quietly, like a sheet slipping off a line. She reached up and unclasped nothing, gave nothing away, only took his ruined burning hand and pressed it flat against the jade at her throat, over the ping-on, over safe passage, so that the warm stone lay between his scarred palm and her heart. Behind them in the lit doorway, her father, who owed this man his life and had watched him now for a season, said in his careful 3 words of English, "Good, good man," and then, in Cantonese, so soft she almost missed it, the letter, "I will answer. Sleep, daughter, you are already home." They were married before the spring runoff, in the plain way of the frontier, and the old way of her people both, and Sukye could never afterward decide which half of the day she loved better. Lung's back room was strung with red paper. Her father brushed himself, his old scholar's hand steady for once, and she served tea on her knees to the spirit tablet of her mother, and to her living father, and Joss, who did not know the forms, watched her and did what she did, and bowed when she bowed, clumsy and grave, and trying so hard that she had to bite her lip not to weep. The assayer's wife came, and Lung, and a handful of countrymen, and 2 of the freightmen who had lowered their torches, hats in their hands, sheepish and welcome. That night Joss hung a second red lantern beside the first, over the door of the wash-house, and the 2 of them burned side by side down the length of the dark street, and no one in Salt Fork threw a stone. The years folded over them the way clean sheets fold, one warm layer on another. The wash-house prospered, because a town will bring its washing to whoever gets it clean, whatever names it called them in the dark. And in time the names grew quieter, and then rare, and then, for the children born after, strange. There was a daughter with her mother's black eyes and her father's slow, careful way of deciding things. And old Choi lived long enough to teach the child to hold a brush and pull the strokes true. Sitting in the sun of the doorway with the small hand inside his stained old one, and when at last his cough carried him off, it was in his sleep, in a warm room, his wife's tablet on the shelf and his line unbroken, which is all a man of his kind ever asked of the Gold Mountain. And Joss Landry, who had not been able to abide the sight of a flame, learned to sit of an evening with his back to the stove and his burned hands quiet in his lap, and did not flinch anymore, because the fire in that house was a small tamed kitchen fire that warmed the people he loved, and it had long since stopped being the fire that took his brother. On a gold evening late in her life, Sukye stood in the doorway of the wash-house with the 2 red lanterns swaying gently above her and watched her granddaughter run the length of the boardwalk in the last of the sun. At the child's throat, on a faded red cord, hung the smooth ring of pale green jade, warm now from a 3rd generation of hands, ping-on, safe passage, passed down the way her mother had pressed it into her palm, on a crowded dock a lifetime and an ocean ago. She felt Joss come up beside her, gray now, slower, his scarred hand finding the small of her back the way it had for 40 years, and she remembered the first time that hand had hovered by her cheek and not dared to touch, and how a man had walked into her family's fire when the whole town wanted them gone, and never once left. The evening smelled of starch and clean steam and chrysanthemum tea, and it was not, anymore, the smell of everything she had lost. It was the smell of everything she had managed, against every odds the hard world had set against her, to keep. And I wonder, my friend, sitting here with you at the close of it, if you had been a soul in Salt Fork on the night that mob came up the street with fire in their hands, would you have lowered your torch and gone home? Or would you have crossed the road to stand in the light beside them? Which one, honestly, do you think you would have been? Tell me down in the comments, because I read every one of them by the fire, and if this story of 2 people the whole frontier said must never meet warmed something in you tonight, stay a while with us, subscribe, and let me tell you the next one.